Let me set the scene for you exactly as it happened. 3 hours before the true nature of the meeting was revealed, Camilla's family had arrived at Ravensmere expecting a standard private formality. They expected a conversation about architecture, not an eviction. And you have to understand why they expected that. For the better part of a decade and a half, the Ravensmere estate had been treated as settled business. We are not talking about a simple country cottage. Ravensmere is 12,000 acres of prime land. It contains a massive Jacobean manor house, 42 individual cottages, 2 highly profitable working farms, a private lake, and an art collection that has never once appeared in any public royal inventory. The assumption of ownership had set in so deeply that the estate staff had already begun referring to one of the large upstairs rooms as the study of Camilla's son. That specific morning, someone on the domestic staff had even placed fresh flowers in that room. They placed fresh flowers in a room they had already mentally handed over to a new family. You need to hold on to that specific image, because by sunset that evening, those flowers would be carried back out and the brass nameplate would be removed. Then Prince William arrived. The manner of his arrival was the very first warning sign, and absolutely nobody in the building read it correctly. There was no motorcade. There was no official announcement from the palace press office. At 8:46 in the morning, a single dark vehicle drove quietly through the eastern gates. He was not alone. 2 senior solicitors stepped out of the vehicle right behind them, and each of them was carrying an identical black document case. That was the second warning sign. The third warning sign is the one that should have entirely emptied the room of oxygen, if anyone present had possessed the situational awareness to understand what it meant. Prince William refused to enter the manor through the main drawing room doors. He completely ignored the primary entrance where the family was waiting. Instead, he walked around the side of the massive house, across the wet gravel courtyard, and let himself in through the old estate office. The estate office is a very specific room. It is the room where the land records, the deeds, and the trust documents have been kept under lock and key since the reign of Queen Victoria. You have to ask yourself, from a purely analytical standpoint, why would the Prince of Wales ignore his family waiting in the drawing room and walk straight into the records office? The answer to that question is the entire foundation of this story. He went to the records office because this was never going to be a family meeting. He had come to the exact room where the structural evidence was kept. He was preparing an execution of paperwork. To comprehend why this landed with such devastating force, you have to look at what Camilla's family genuinely believed that morning, and more importantly, why they believed it. They were not acting out of thin air. They were acting on what they had been repeatedly told. By 9 o'clock, Camilla had been informed that William was in the building. According to internal accounts, she assumed he was there to review the renovation budgets. That was a completely logical assumption, because there were highly detailed renovation plans already in motion. The east wing of the manor desperately needed structural reinforcement. 2 of the historical roofs were leaking and required specialist lead work. Furthermore, there had been quiet, persistent conversations about converting several of the estate cottages into permanent homes for members of her extended family. King Charles, by all reliable accounts, had encouraged every single piece of this planning. However, he had not done so formally. That word, formally, is the legal hinge upon which this entire situation swings. He encouraged it privately. He encouraged it in the exact way that powerful families make vast promises when they are absolutely certain that nobody will ever ask them to produce the legal documentation to back it up. He gave them his word. According to sources, Charles had used 5 specific words on multiple occasions. "You will always have Ravensmere." 5 seemingly harmless words of reassurance. But in the world of estate law, words stop being harmless the exact second someone starts spending money because they believe them. And Camilla's family had started spending money. Architectural plans had been professionally drawn up. Custom furniture had been meticulously measured for specific alcoves. One relative had reportedly already initiated discussions about moving a valuable collection of horses onto the southern paddocks of the estate. Imagine absorbing that level of confirmation year after year. Imagine being treated as the inevitable future owner every single time your car drove through those eastern gates. Then imagine Prince William walking into the estate office, placing a 6-page legal opinion directly on the table, and speaking. He looked at the room and stated, very quietly, "None of you were ever beneficiaries." I want you to analyze that specific sentence. It does not just change the meaning of the meeting, it fundamentally rewrites the past 15 years of their lives. Because suddenly, every single one of those private promises from the king means something entirely different. Every renovation they planned becomes a severe legal question. Every room they comfortably started calling their own legally belongs to someone else. But to whom did it belong? That was the exact question hanging heavily over the entire table, and for the moment, it was the one question Prince William refused to answer. He sat completely still, letting the reality of the situation settle over the room. Look at the phrase he chose to use. None of you were ever beneficiaries. The phrasing is quietly brutal. He did not say, "You have lost the estate." He did not say, "I have decided to take the estate back." Both of those statements would imply that it had once belonged to them to lose. He used the past tense. He said, "were ever." He reached all the way back to a time before any of them had even walked through the gates of Ravensmere. In just a few words, he completely erased their future and reclassified their entire past as a profound legal misunderstanding. 15 years of being shown wine cellars, measuring for custom furniture, and calling a room the study, all of it was recast in a single legal clause as an activity that never possessed a single shred of legal footing. That is a far colder blow than an argument born of anger. Anger implies a relationship where someone has been crossed. What William communicated was something much worse. He communicated that there was never any relationship to the property to begin with. Camilla walked into the estate office just after 9:20. King Charles followed her inside a few minutes later. By all accounts, the king was visibly irritated. He was not yet irritated by the legal reality, but by the simple fact that this meeting had not been cleared through his office first. And right here is the first definitive tell of where the actual power resided in that room. When the King of the United Kingdom entered the small estate office, the Prince of Wales did not stand up. William stayed seated in his chair beside the lead solicitor. William kept one hand resting calmly on a faded antique leather folder. Charles looked directly at that folder the moment he walked in, because he instantly recognized the gold crest stamped into the leather. It was the personal crest of his grandmother, the Queen Mother. Internal accounts state that this was the exact moment the confident irritation completely drained out of his face. A man with Charles's institutional experience does not need a solicitor to read the documents to him to know what it means when his son arrives holding the Queen Mother's private trust papers. 1043, Charles already knew deep in his gut that he had just lost a massive piece of control. He simply did not yet know the specific mechanism of how he had lost it. The folder was the mechanism. So let me detail exactly what that leather folder contained, because this is the precise moment a situation stops being a domestic family squabble and becomes a surgical legal operation. Ravensmere was not a property that Charles had ever purchased. It was not a property that could simply be granted to Camilla by royal decree. This often surprises people who do not understand royal wealth structures, but Ravensmere was not even part of the Crown estate portfolio. It existed entirely outside of that. Ravensmere sat securely inside a completely private family settlement. This was a highly specific legal structure that had been created decades earlier, and it had been amended 3 separate times by senior members of the family to ensure absolute control over the asset. You have to follow the history of these amendments because they formed the exact trap that Charles walked into. The first historical amendment protected the physical acreage of the land. The Second Amendment protected the manor house and its architectural integrity. But the Third Amendment protected the one specific thing that nobody in Camilla's family had ever thought to verify. The Third Amendment controlled the succession clause. It dictated the absolute, unbreakable rules regarding who was legally permitted to inherit the estate next. What King Charles held in strict legal terms was something called a life interest. Let me explain this concept plainly because it is the absolute hinge upon which this entire confrontation turns. A life interest means you only get to utilize an asset for the duration of your natural life. Charles was perfectly entitled to live at Ravensmere. He had the right to maintain the grounds. He was legally permitted to draw a certain percentage of the income generated by the two working farms. But here is the massive legal wall that his private promises violently collided with. Charles possessed zero legal authority to permanently transfer the estate outside of the strict bloodline named in the original settlement. He could not do it by verbal promise. He could not do it by writing a letter. He could not even do it by issuing a royal command. He held the keys to the manor house for his lifetime only. He never, at any point in the last 15 years, possessed the legal right to decide who would receive those keys after he was gone. Yet he had been confidently promising exactly that outcome to his wife's family. At this point in the meeting, Camilla's daughter asked an incredibly obvious, entirely reasonable question. It is the exact question any logical person would ask in that situation. If the king completely controls the estate during his lifetime, why is he not allowed to choose what happens to it afterward? The lead solicitor calmly opened the faded leather folder, looked at the table, and delivered the answer that dropped the temperature in the room to absolute zero. The solicitor explained that the king's choice in the matter had been legally removed before his second marriage ever took place. The choice was not removed after the wedding ceremony. It was executed before it. Somebody within the royal apparatus had anticipated this exact future conflict. Somebody had foreseen Charles marrying Camilla and Camilla's family slowly drifting their personal roots into the Ravensmere estate. Whoever it was had quietly and permanently shut the legal door on that possibility years before anyone else in the family even realized there was going to be a door to shut. Naturally, every single person in the room instantly assumed the architect behind this move was the late Queen Elizabeth. The entire table looked at Prince William, waiting for him to invoke the late Queen's name as the authority behind the document. But William did not say her name because Queen Elizabeth was not the one who signed the amendment. The lead solicitor slid the document forward. The amendment was drafted and signed in November of 1999. That is a highly significant date. It was 3 years before the Queen Mother passed away and a full 6 years before Charles and Camilla were officially married. Right there, immediately next to the Queen Mother's signature at the bottom of the parchment was a second signature securing the amendment. It was the signature of Princess Margaret. The atmosphere in the estate office instantly shifted from tense to highly personal. Anyone who is familiar with the internal dynamics of this family knows exactly how Princess Margaret operated. She was sharp-eyed, deeply suspicious of outsiders, and fiercely, almost ferociously protective of the private family properties and historical assets. According to the extensive documentation in the folder, Princess Margaret raised a very specific, highly calculated concern in 1999. She formally documented her fear that Ravensmere could one day pass, through the mechanism of a second marriage, into a family that the original settler had never explicitly named. Margaret did not write an emotional letter accusing anyone of greed. She absolutely did not need to do that. The cold legal wording of the amendment did all the aggressive work for her, and the terminology she approved was calculated to freeze out any ambiguity. The clause read exactly like this: no spouse, no child of a spouse, and no descendant unrelated by direct blood to the line of King George VI shall acquire permanent title, controlling interest, or beneficial ownership of the Ravensmere estate. I want you to sit with the sheer weight of what that clause actually means in practice, because it is far crueler than simply being named and excluded. Camilla's children were not singled out by their individual names in that legal document. They did not warrant that level of specific recognition. Instead, they were completely excluded as a type of human being who could never hold a title, and this classification was locked into the trust years before the marriage that would connect them to the royal family had even occurred. Two senior royal women in 1999 sat in a room, looked far into the future, accurately predicted the exact shape of a blended family that did not officially exist yet, and methodically legislated that entire family out of the inheritance in advance. That level of maneuvering is not a simple family squabble over a country house. That is devastating foresight with a legally binding signature attached to it. and we must continuously return to the exact timing of those signatures, because it completely reframes the historical narrative. Think analytically about where the core members of the royal family actually stood in 1999. Charles and Camilla were not married. They were not even formally presented to the public as a permanent couple in the strategic way they would be later. The entire massive public relations operation designed to rehabilitate their relationship in the eyes of the British public was still years away from being fully realized. The situation was highly volatile and publicly delicate. Therefore, for two senior, deeply experienced members of the royal family to sit down with trust lawyers in 1999 and demand a clause specifically designed to keep a future spouse's bloodline completely away from a key family estate, they had to be reading the board with absolute ruthless clarity. They were not reacting defensively to something that had already happened. They were preemptively striking against an outcome they were absolutely certain was going to happen eventually. They understood the trajectory of Charles's intentions better than Charles himself did at the time. Whatever your personal historical opinion of Princess Margaret might be, and the history books have not always treated her kindly, you are forced to admit that this was a chillingly accurate, long-range analysis of exactly how this family dynamic would drift over the next quarter of a century. She saw the immense wealth of the estate quietly sliding toward the Parker Bowles orbit before there was even a legal marriage to facilitate that slide. She identified the vulnerability and she poured concrete over the road before the road was even fully built. 2021. The media and the public love to focus on Prince William's supposed foresight and ruthlessness in these modern property stories. But the truth in the estate office that morning was that William was merely executing the final move of a strategy that his great-aunt had engineered when he was just a teenager. Now, it is crucial to examine the actual human weight buried underneath all of that cold, impenetrable legal language. It is incredibly easy to read a phrase like "protect the bloodline" and dismiss it as nothing more than pure, antiquated, aristocratic snobbery. However, from a legal and historical perspective, that is not entirely what was happening. These massive, multi-generational family settlements exist for a very specific reason. Houses like Ravensmere, with their thousands of acres and centuries of history, are not actually owned by the individual breathing person currently living inside them. They are held in a strict, continuous trust on behalf of an ongoing bloodline. The entire foundational concept of these estates is that the current occupant is merely a temporary custodian, not an absolute owner. You do not own the bricks, you simply maintain them for the next generation. The property is supposed to pass directly through you to the direct children of the blood, and your singular, overriding responsibility is to hand the estate on to them completely intact, without debts, without encumbrances, and without third-party claims. Therefore, when Princess Margaret and the Queen Mother drew that impenetrable legal line in the sand in 1999, they were not just being arbitrarily possessive of a nice house in the country. In their own severe, highly disciplined way, they were actively protecting the property rights of children who had not even been born yet. They were legally insulating the future inheritance of Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, a generation of heirs that neither Margaret nor the Queen Mother would ever live to meet. They used trust law to reach across decades and protect their descendants. And that specific point, more than any other detail in the room, is exactly why Prince William refused to let this issue slide. Because the primary individual that the 1999 clause was ultimately designed to protect was not a distant relative, it was his own children's direct inheritance. For William, the situation at Ravensmere was never an abstract legal debate. It was his children's birthright sitting in a leather folder, while entirely different people were actively measuring the rooms to install their own custom furniture. He was defending his successors. At this tense juncture in the meeting, King Charles leaned forward toward the lead solicitor and stated something that, based on his reaction, I believe he genuinely thought was true. He looked at the documents and said, "I was never informed of this specific clause." That was the moment Prince William finally broke his silence, looked directly across the table at his father, and delivered the first truly devastating counterpunch of the morning. William simply stated, "You signed a formal acknowledgement of it." Immediately upon William speaking those words, the second solicitor reached into the document case and placed a high-resolution photocopy directly onto the center of the wooden table. There was no ambiguity. It was right there in black ink. It was King Charles's own distinct signature at the very bottom of the acknowledgement page, clearly dated November of 1999. The reigning king of the United Kingdom was forced to sit in silence, staring down at his own name on the exact legal document that had just meticulously dismantled 15 years of his private promises. According to those present, Charles slowly turned the copied page over, scrutinized the date again, looked back up at William, and for several long, deeply uncomfortable seconds, he had absolutely nothing to say. The silence in the estate office was absolute. But the lead solicitor was not finished, and this specific legal explanation is where the strategy becomes even more intricate. It also explains exactly how a highly educated, well-advised man like Charles managed to walk directly into such an obvious legal snare. The legal acknowledgement that Charles had signed back in 1999 had not been presented to him as a standalone hostile document. The palace lawyers at the time did not walk into his office and say, "Here is the specific clause designed to stop your future wife's family from inheriting Ravensmere." Instead, the restrictive clause had been deeply buried. It was attached as a minor addendum to a vastly broader, incredibly complex financial restructuring package that involved 6 entirely different royal properties scattered across the country. Within that mountain of dense financial paperwork, the Ravensmere estate was only explicitly mentioned twice. The first time, it was identified solely by a dry alphanumeric legal parcel number. The second time, it was listed under an obscure, older historical name for the estate that had not been used in any public capacity since 1936. So, when analyzing the king's defense, there are 2 distinct possibilities. Charles may genuinely have signed that massive stack of restructuring documents in 1999 without ever once registering what that single, deeply buried clause actually meant for his personal future. Alternatively, the second possibility is that he understood the restrictive clause perfectly well at the time of signing, but simply arrogantly told himself that he possessed the royal authority to have it quietly amended or overturned at a later date when his position was stronger. Nobody can see inside his head in 1999. However, if you carefully observe exactly what Charles attempted to do over the following 2 decades, his subsequent legal actions point incredibly hard toward that second version of events. Because the truth is, the 1999 clause actually could be changed. That tiny legal loophole was the exact mechanism that Camilla's family and their advisors had been quietly counting on the entire time. The settlement was not entirely locked. In order to alter the succession clause, Charles simply needed to secure the unanimous legal consent of the surviving trustees of the settlement. But by the time this morning meeting took place, time and mortality had drastically altered the board. There was now only one surviving senior trustee whose legal approval actually carried the necessary weight to change the rules. That one single trustee was Prince William. And right there, the entire dynamic of the room snaps into perfect focus. Now you understand exactly why William had walked into that estate office, bypassing the drawing room, and why he had taken control of the antique keys. William was not a guest at this meeting. He was not there to offer an opinion. Legally speaking, he was the absolute gatekeeper of the estate. And what makes the situation even more fascinating is that Charles had already desperately tried to bypass that gate several months earlier. Charles did not attempt to force the gate directly. That would have been far too obvious and would have triggered an immediate confrontation. Instead, a senior palace aide had reportedly sent Prince William a highly polished, carefully worded legal proposal outlining a new vision for Ravensmere. The proposal described the future of the estate using an incredibly soft, diplomatic term. They called it a continuity arrangement. Think about the pure public relations spin of that phrase, continuity. It's a beautiful, harmless-sounding word specifically designed to make a private, unauthorized promise permanent. When Prince William received that continuity arrangement proposal, he did not argue. He simply sent back one highly specific, deeply structural legal question to his father's aides. He asked,
who ultimately receives the beneficial interest. He bypassed the flowery language and demanded the core financial truth. He wanted to know who actually ends up legally owning the tangible value of this 12,000-acre asset. The truthful answer from Charles's legal team came back 2 days later. The aides admitted that under the proposed continuity arrangement, a new family trust would be formally created, and the explicit beneficiaries of this new trust would legally include Camilla's children and her grandchildren. Prince William reportedly took a pen, wrote exactly one word in the margin of the official proposal, and sent the document straight back to the king's office. The word he wrote was rejected. He shut down the direct transfer instantly. But King Charles and his legal advisors did not stop trying to find a way around the rules, and their second attempt to bypass the rules was significantly cleverer. It was a genuinely sophisticated piece of legal engineering.
Under the parameters of the second proposal, Camilla's family would not technically own the Ravensmere estate at all. On paper, the absolute title of the estate would remain safely locked inside the original royal settlement, strictly adhering to Margaret's bloodline rules. Instead of transferring ownership, the proposal suggested that Camilla's family would simply receive a 99-year lease on the entire Ravensmere property, and they would be charged a purely nominal rent of exactly £1 per year. You have to step back and admire the sheer structural audacity of that move. From a strict technical standpoint, nothing legally leaves the royal bloodline. The trust retains the deed. But practically speaking, Prince William and his own royal children are completely locked out of the use of that house for an entire century. It was the absolute equivalent of full ownership in everything but the actual legal title. And honestly, it was an incredibly sharp legal maneuver that almost worked. It was almost clever enough to bypass the restrictions. Except, the two senior women who meticulously drafted that amendment back in 1999 had already anticipated the concept of long-term leases. They built a secondary trapdoor right into the foundation of the trust to prevent exactly this scenario. The fine print of the settlement explicitly stated that any rental or lease agreement extending for a period longer than 21 years automatically required the unanimous, formally signed approval of the active trustees, which meant that Charles's brilliant 99-year workaround still hit a brick wall. It still had to go directly across Prince William's desk for a final signature. And William, acting in his absolute capacity as the primary trustee, categorically rejected that proposal as well. I want you to pause and deeply analyze those two consecutive rejected proposals, because taken together, they reveal something incredibly important about how modern royal conflicts are actually fought. They're not fought with shouting matches in the drawing room. They are fought with trust structures and lease agreements. Look at the clear escalation in legal cleverness. The first proposal from Charles's team was almost painfully naive. Just create a new trust and publicly name Camilla's children as the ultimate beneficiaries. It was blunt, it was obvious, and it walked straight into the 1999 wall. William swatted it away with a single word. But the second proposal, the 99-year lease, that is the work of a highly paid solicitor who had actually sat down, read the 1999 amendment line by line, and deliberately went looking for a subterranean gap in the armor. A century-long lease at £1 a year is a genuinely sophisticated strategic move, because on paper, it perfectly respects every single written rule. The royal bloodline keeps the historic title. Nothing is permanently transferred. The asset is merely rented to people who are legally barred from ever owning it. Somebody on King Charles's side of the board had thoroughly studied the legal trap and actively tried to tunnel underneath it. And that specific, documented effort is what definitively proved this entire situation was not a harmless misunderstanding. You do not accidentally engineer a highly complex 99-year legal workaround to a restrictive trust clause that you claim you didn't know existed. The existence of the second proposal is absolute, undeniable proof that someone on Charles's team knew exactly what the 1999 amendment mandated, and they were trying to defeat it anyway. And the fact that the Queen Mother's original amendment had already preemptively closed the long lease loophole, anticipating that a future occupant might try to rent the estate away for a century, is the exact moment you have to realize the sheer genius of what those two women built in 1999.
They did not just write a simple rule blocking a transfer, they wargamed the scenario. They anticipated the specific, highly technical ways a future king and his legal team would attempt to get around the primary rule, and they blocked the secondary routes in advance decades before the conflict even began. A direct title transfer? Blocked. A secondary beneficiary trust? Blocked. A century-long lease dressed up as a benign family rental agreement? Blocked. It is exactly as if they played out every single legal move Charles would eventually attempt to make and left a lethal countermove waiting in the file for each one. They sealed those countermoves in a leather folder and left them there for 26 years. That level of foresight is not ordinary estate planning. That is the work of individuals who understood exactly what the future held, and who utterly refused to let personal sentiment defeat structural integrity. And legally, logically, that second rejection by Prince William should have been the absolute end of the conversation. 2 formal proposals had been submitted, 2 firm rejections had been issued by the controlling trustee. The door was closed. But exactly 3 weeks after William rejected the 99-year lease, independent contractors physically showed up at the Ravensmere estate. They were not there to fix the leaking historical roofs. They were not there to inspect the agricultural drainage. They were there to conduct a highly detailed, private residential survey. These contractors spent days meticulously measuring the entire West Wing. They closely inspected the structural capacities of the main kitchens. They systematically assessed whether the massive old nursery corridor on the second floor could be completely gutted and converted into a series of modern, self-contained family apartments. And absolutely nobody in the king's office thought to inform William that this survey was taking place. And right here is the fatal administrative mistake. This is the exact error in judgment that accelerated a quiet, bureaucratic disagreement into the brutal morning confrontation in the estate office. The financial invoice for that extensive residential survey was quietly charged directly to an internal estate maintenance account. And it just so happened that this specific maintenance account is one that William now actively helps oversee as part of his broader portfolio of royal asset management. It was a significant payment of £18,400, and it was tucked very neatly into a ledger between a routine heritage roof repair and some standard agricultural drainage on the eastern farm. It was designed to blend in and vanish into the massive operating budget of the estate. But it was not the monetary amount that caught William's eye when he reviewed the ledgers. £18,000 is irrelevant in the context of Ravensmere's operating budget. It was the specific accounting description attached to the invoice that triggered the alarm. The invoice was explicitly classified under the heading Future Occupancy Adaptation. Future occupancy? By whom? Nobody had informed the man who legally controlled the gates that the house was being structurally adapted for a set of new permanent residents. And right here is the fatal administrative mistake. This is the exact error in judgment that accelerated a quiet, bureaucratic disagreement into the brutal morning confrontation in the estate office. The financial invoice for that extensive residential survey was quietly charged directly to an internal estate maintenance account. And it just so happened that this specific maintenance account is one that William now actively helps oversee as part of his broader portfolio of royal asset management. It was a significant payment of £18,400, and it was tucked very neatly into a ledger between a routine heritage roof repair and some standard agricultural drainage on the eastern farm. It was designed to blend in and vanish into the massive operating budget of the estate. But it was not the monetary amount that caught William's eye when he reviewed the ledgers. £18,000 is irrelevant in the context of Ravensmere's operating budget. It was the specific accounting description attached to the invoice that triggered the alarm. The invoice was explicitly classified under the heading Future Occupancy Adaptation. Future occupancy? By whom? Nobody had informed the man who legally controlled the gate that the house was being structurally adapted for a set of new permanent residents. And right here is the fatal administrative mistake. This is the exact error in judgment that accelerated a quiet, bureaucratic disagreement into the brutal morning confrontation in the estate office. And honestly, from a purely professional standpoint of asset protection, it is the exact same forensic protocol I would have executed if I were in his position managing a trust of that magnitude. William did not immediately call his father and shout. He did not issue a press release. He quietly went into the financial systems and pulled every single recent, pending, and cleared invoice connected to the Ravensmere property code over the last 18 months. And what he found buried in the ledgers was a complete blueprint of intent. He found massive custom furniture orders. He found invoices for bespoke, architectural-grade shelving designed for specific alcoves in the West Wing. He found the preliminary billing for a highly advanced, temperature-controlled wine room. He discovered architectural plans showing 2 large historical bathrooms being completely gutted and redesigned with modern, high-end fixtures specifically chosen for private, long-term residents. And the most damning piece of evidence was not what was ordered, but whose name was attached to the delivery manifests. The delivery name on the most significant custom furniture orders was not King Charles. It was not Queen Camilla. The name explicitly printed on the external supplier's commercial invoice was Parker Bowles. Right there in black and white on a third-party supplier's commercial invoice was absolute proof. The family that the 1999 legal amendment had explicitly barred from ever owning the house was currently having custom, permanent architectural features built directly into its walls using trust funds. I need you to fully appreciate the profound legal significance of that paperwork discovery. To an outside observer, a structural survey and a few large furniture orders might sound like incredibly small, dry, unimportant administrative details. They're not. In trust law, they are undeniable evidence of operational intent. You do not authorize the construction of a permanent structural temperature-controlled wine room, and you do not redesign multiple heritage heating bathrooms for specific private residents in a house you're merely planning to visit for occasional weekend holidays. You execute that specific level of structural modification in a house you're actively planning to inhabit permanently. Therefore, the financial paperwork William uncovered did not just embarrass the parties involved, it fundamentally documented an unauthorized strategy. It revealed a quiet, highly methodical, incredibly expensive operation to gradually turn the Ravensmere estate into a fully lived-in, customized family